Thank you very much. So first of all, I will also join my predecessors and colleagues in thanking the organizer. I'm very pleased to be here in my hometown to join you for this conference. I'm very happy for your persistence through the years. I'm very happy to Angela specifically for her friendship and time with, I don't always feel like I deserve. For Andrea, for the opportunity to actually reconnect with some friends and people I've long admired, people like Saskia, Manuela, and Marius, and many others, and Yelda herself, whom I've seen before our life were wrecked. So I'm here to represent a forehand production. So in addition to that, furthermore, the project such as it stands now represents a bid for the Italian government to actually to expand into a collateral line of inquiry which is related to our ERC project that we have in Milan. So that makes my position a little bit uncomfortable or difficult because I'm here to represent something that whose ramifications I cannot possibly fulfill. So what I decided to do, my task is to take about 15 minutes of time and actually give you one single demonstration, which is to say the Accademia del Cimento, which is normally seen and perceived as a one-book academy, is an academy that produced only one title in print, which is, as you know, the Saggi di Naturali Esperienze, printed in 1667. My task is to somehow suggest avenues for you to understand that the production of this academy cannot be reduced to just one book. And in fact, the best way to account for this, for the people, the members of the academy, and all the constellation of projects that were pivoted around the academy, is actually to look at it as a polycentric network. So that describes a part of the title. It describes also why we're pushing the chronology beyond the boundaries. The academy, the Cimento network was operative under the aegis of Leopoldo de' Medici before Leopoldo took his post as a cardinal in Rome. So he had a 10-year lifespan between 1657 to 1667. And then he died, formally anyway, although he was never formally chartered. And so we are pushing the boundaries. We are claiming that there is a legacy in print of works related to the Accademia del Cimento, which actually takes us to the early 1680s. And so that's also a kind of a transformative, if you want, revisionist view compared to the status quo of the literature on the Cimento. Finally, an explanation of what do we mean by the viral. The viral has nothing to do with contagion itself. It is designed to account at best for the moments that Mordecai Feingold has identified in an essay of 2009 as interactive awareness between European academies of science. Now, this is a fairly well-known fact, although what is less known is that the production, especially the experimental production of these academies, spike. They tend to, if you look at the documents, and especially the vast, unglamorous diaries and documents that are preserved in the National Library of Florence concerning the Cimento, you see that there are pivotal moments, and these moments are typically related to either a visit of a character. For instance, Isaac Barrow visits Florence. In a minor key, also John Finch. The books of Boyle arrive in a precise moment in the mid-1660s, and that creates a number of reactions that are at first epistolary, and then they are rooted and funneled through a printed project as well. So we think that viral is a system that actually accounts in a sort of in a better way for these moments of heightened awareness. And in fact, I should mention at the outset that typically, normally, the Cimento Academy is seen as a post-Galilean, as an exercise in post-Galilean epistemology, and you understand why. I mean, the legacy, the Tuscany, just as typically it is assumed that Giovanni Alfonso Borelli is de facto the leader of the experimental activity within the Academy. Now, assigning a leadership, de jure or de facto in a collective enterprise is very, very tricky. As Yelda just mentioned the role of Hooke. I mean, remember what was the Royal Society, the literature on the Royal Society before Hooke was reintegrated as, a fundamental, pivotal moment of that experience. So if you take Borelli as the leader of the experimental activity, the vision, the picture that you have is a fairly traditional post-Aristotelian canvas of Galilean legacies, exemplified primarily in medical, biological interest as well as mathematical. And in the end, you have a speculative, deductive methodology. But Borelli is very much a character, a school of his own, as it were. And he is well known for his contentious, outspoken rivalries with many people within and beyond Italy. So if you remove Borelli from the equation, what you have is actually something that looks like 80–90% of projects that are in fact inductive and very much influenced by Cartesianism, even though it is normally assumed, once again, and I have to push against this traditional wisdom, that Cartesianism is not diffused in the country, with the exception of Naples, and fairly later in this period. So when you remove Borelli from the equation, what happens is that all of a sudden the Cimento network looks a lot like the Accademia degli Investiganti in Bologna, looks a lot like the English counterpart and even the French counterpart, and it looks a lot like the research has been handed over by the microscopist in the Netherlands. So that gave us an opportunity to actually see this kind of polycentrism at play, and in order to arrive at that picture, we essentially had to flatten out, as it were, the impact of Borelli within this network. So I cannot say too much about this, but I'll be interested, to discuss more about this. Related to this is also the idea that the literature on the Cimentos was very much pioneered by a single brilliant essay by an Italian historian of science, which is operating in the 1980s, and this is Paolo Galluzzi, who wrote a piece in the Quaderni Storici, a journal associated with Il Mulino, with the kind of Gramscian operation of hegemony. And for Galluzzi, the Cimento network is primarily to be understood as the direct emanation of the, as he called it, I gusti del principe. So it is an emanation of the princely taste of Leopoldo, and everything is an effect of this kind of strategy of patronage. Now, let's stop for a minute and let me give you one example of how difficult it is to consider the saggi di naturali esperienze, first of all, as something that fits within these parameters, and secondly, also as a kind of framework, a larger framework, a template to study the early scientific academies of Europe. If you look back at the predecessor of the Cimento, which would be the Accademia dei Lincei, and if you look at the Mexican treasury, which was published in 1651, what you notice there, on the one hand, is a celebratory moment which definitely defines and capitalizes on a moment, a specific historical moment where papal Rome turns global. And that is, the signification of that print. But then you have a 25 years delay between the original work that brought to that, so you have a continuous, perpetual repositioning of patronage, which is actually true also of the Cimento, and it's true of people who collaborated with the Cimento, such as Athanasius Kircher, who some of his books you see on that glass over there, and he was repositioning through a printing, actually almost a monopoly that he gave to the printers in the Netherlands, and essentially used Leopoldo and his network to further, let's say, advertise his particular brand of Jesuit erudition throughout the Habsburg court in Prague, and then beyond, as I said, publishing his books exclusively in the Netherlands. So what you see is essentially a notion that between the early assemblages of the Mexican treasury and the final publication, there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of temporal delay, which is actually documented in epistolary exchanges, in drafts, in list of desiderata, and actually the same thing, the same scribal sort of ecology of media is at play in the Cimento. So before the 1667 edition of the Saggi, what you have is that the Saggi themselves are a selection of about 100 experiments. They are very, very weird selection to begin with, because it's hard to find, for example, a lot of the anatomy that was going on, a lot of the pneumatics that was going on. And this selection has always been thought to be a sort of a manifestation of the rhetoric of prudence and Leopoldian Florence. But in fact, there is a lot of ambiguity, and the best way to look at this book, just as the Tesoro Messicano, is to look at it as a palimpsestic sort of object. And so that also enhances the idea of the polycentric networks in the islands of scientific production. Now, here comes the part where I need to kind of, trust your will, patience, follow me. I cannot go into too detail. I'll take 2 or 3 minutes, at least in my design. I was meant to give you an idea what are these islands that we see that really represent or create the polycentric nature of the Cimento. The first one is medical and anatomical. There are a number of works They really are crucial for this network of scientists, and they unfortunately haven't been discussed in relation to the institutional history of the Academy per se. And those range from Lorenzo Bellini's to Malpighi himself, the anatomical observations, De Pulmonibus. This is 1661, 1662. Then we move to the end of, to the end of the Cimento experience. With there are other works, primarily Steno, the famous dissection of the shark head, which was produced to Florence, brought to Florence by the fishing community in Livorno. Still by Steno, 2 years later, 1669, 2 years after the Cimento, there is the Miologie, which are actually a work on the muscles, which is done more geometrico, and more geometrico is a sort of mathematization, as we know from the studies of Raphael Andrò and many others, that actually is directly related to the activity of the Cimento. And some scholars now tend to see Steno's output within the larger epistemic genre of the Leopoldan Historia, which is a sort of post-Aristotelian, still erudite compilation of anatomical data. And then beyond that, we have the Esperienze of Francesco Redi, which is 1669, on the life of the insects, which really closed this kind of island. The second one is about mathesis, and there are many books that are important. First of all, Borelli himself publishes a lot. He produces an edition of partial editions of the Conics by Apollonius of Perga, which is actually collaboration with an Orientalist from the Vatican Library, Abraham Ekelensis. And we have a lot of letters and coming and going, and there are other people involved, and also has something to do with the issuing of privileges for printing in the Netherlands. So this is an episode that is very much inscribed in the Cimento, that actually is characterized by a very unusual, intense collaboration between Viviani and Borelli, and nobody has really done much about it, but it is a proper edition of Apollonius, which is a proper product of the Accademia del Cimento and has never been considered as such. Beyond that, Viviani writes De Maximis et Minimis. We have also Carlo Rinaldini, who will become eventually a formidable Aristotelian in Padua. And so he would attempt to graft the experience of the Cimento within a sort of post-Zabarellan, let's say, for the sake of brevity, epistemology, whereby you sort of circumvent the prohibition of not having a demonstratio through, syllogistic means, but actually doing something that looks a lot more like Cartesian induction. And I'm sorry, this is extremely brief, but so again, this is also my time at my disposal. And then finally, so Viviani, Borelli, Rinaldini, and we have Carlo Roberto Dati, who also publishes a letter in Italian on the cycloid, and that concludes the sort of the realm of mathesis. There is a third aspect of the project that again, I'm not going into. These are monographs produced by members of the Cimento who retain an institutional legacy with the group, and they publish things when the Academy was formally disbanded. So we can go into that. There is another avenue of research, which is one I aim to conclude if I have 2 or 3 minutes, and this will be the role of reviews, book reviews, international book reviews. And then finally, we have to mention a botanist from the 18th century, the famous Giovanni Targioni Tozzetti. Some of you will know. Targioni Tozzetti produced a book that is very much a celebration of the science of Leopoldo in the era of Leopoldo de' Medici, and he preserved, because of, strangely enough, because of the propagandistic nature of that book, he preserved a number of documents. He's actually, Targioni Tozzetti is one of the few, is where we find sources that are not available in Florence at the Nazionale. For example, he preserved notes from John Finch's notebooks of anatomy that he performed while he was in Pisa, and also as an English resident, first in Livorno and then in Istanbul. And he also preserved notes of Dati himself concerning biology. So Targioni Tozzetti is a great source to actually undermine the construction of the Cimento as an academy that just produced one book, and a very particular book, a book that is affected by a sort of self-censorship, by an issue of rhetoric, and the whole sort of Christian Democrat construction of this book as a kind of operation of prudence. Now, I don't know if I used 13, 14 minutes. I'll take 2 or 3 more, because I wanted to give you an example of how book reviews are stimulating within this canvas. Now, we know We know from scholars like Elizabeth Yale, we know from Richard Eo research on the notebooks and the virtuosi, we know that as print historians, when we handle certain situations, we have to be aware, we have to be attentive of the marginalia, we have to be attentive of the construction of a work. But there is a considerably less emphasis on how book reviews actually standardize a scientific monograph throughout Europe. Book reviews are not only limited to those who appeared in journals such as the transactions, the Transactions of the Royal Society, the Journal de Savant, and you name it, but it's also epistolary. So to give you an example, Lorenzo Panciatichi, who was a proxy agent for books, it was a book, sort of a erudite, a part of the Accademia del Cimento, also part of the Accademia della Crusca. He traveled in the Netherlands and he reviewed in 1671, at the age of 36, he wrote back to Leopoldo de' Medici, and he reviewed a book by Jan Swammerdam, which was in Dutch, but he has a Latin title, Historia Insectorum, and then he proceeded, it would only be translated in 1685, and actually we have it here, the Braidense, the part of the Haller collection, anyway, so that is the kind of Latin version, but the Dutch version was reviewed in 1671, and what Panciatichi had to say is extremely important, because Panciatichi was collaborating for the second edition of the Dizionario dell'Accademia della Crusca, which is, of the 3 editions that you may know, the one more interested in scientific terminology, because it is an attempt to essentially rehearse Galilean language of science. And one of the things that Panciatichi and Dati do in their collaboration for the second edition of the dictionary, which is in the 1660s, is to effectively flatten the language of experiment. So experiencia and experiment become one and one thing only through there. So it's significant that Panciatichi is so interested in this Dutch monograph on the insects, because the same thing happens over there. There is a kind of standardization of evolutionary language that has to do, and so it's interesting that beyond the barrier, I don't think Panciatichi could read Dutch, but beyond the linguistic barrier, they obviously talked, and so the review, such as it is also a report. Is essentially a 3-page report, and he says many things about the book that I cannot go into detail, unfortunately or fortunately, but one of the things he says is that the book is said speculata, is characterized by an imagination based on new experiments, and the language and a series of details show that this is very much Cartesian. What he has in mind, what Panciatichi had in mind, was Cartesianism. Now there is a big discussion whether Swammerdam himself, wanted or did not want to appear as a Cartesian. There is a sense in which his research may probably better seen as a simple reflection of what the Leiden circle of anatomy was at the time, but it was fairly Cartesian in the broad sense of like some kind of non-reductive mechanicism. And this is interesting because we always assume, as I said, that the Cimento is anti-Cartesian, is rather Aristotelian or post-Galilean or something else. But in fact, another letter by Cosimo Brunetti, which reviews another series of books that were appearing in North Europe, reports back to Leopoldo and ensures the shipping of these printed materials. And this, again, is in the middle of in the very center of the Cimento network activity. And these books are Hogelande, Descartes himself. There are 5, 6, 7 volumes that actually arrive in Florence, and they're accompanied by these book reviews that essentially systematize. And here I come to my conclusion. What the reviews do, they systematize the language of experiments. They function. This is our sort of thesis. They function to orchestrate the blueprints to perform experiments. So there is a sense in which the Cimento Academy is very much a community of replication. And within that construction, there is a difference between reruns and replication. I cannot go again into further detail about this. Obviously, it is different. This is not a Baconian group, so the main purpose is not to approach what Bacon thought was the unfriendliness of nature. So to essentially, mitigate the effect of a lack of experience in the experimenter or the particular difficult material that there are materials that are difficult to give results. Apart from ethical implications, you know, when you dissect a dog or an animal, obviously Magalotti and others were very, very unhappy, and Steno himself has letters about that. But what the reviews, looking at the print output of an academy through the lenses of the book reviews, what it does is that allows us to see how these issues of rerunning and retrying and experiments were actually handled. And the reviews many times actually respond directly to the needs of a community of experimenters located at a different geographical location, how to replicate. So it becomes, so reviews becomes this kind of blueprints for experiment. Unfortunately, we don't have too many studies. Only Francesco Redi's work on the snakes and the vipers have been really properly or more scientifically assessed. There is Domenico Bertoloni Meli who talked about parallel experiments, but I do think that this is, we strongly perceive that this is an area that would yield many results. And I only gave you an example of Panchatic in the Netherlands. I could have done many more things with the Royal Society. I chose not to. I am very, very happy. Sorry for my torrent of information, and time managing is as good as it can be. Thanks.